All right, last episode of oxygen management, and Tim rambling on about all things wine. So this is a really important piece. This is filtering and bottling consideration because um, let's be honest, finishing is where everything can go wrong. This is the most crucial part of winemaking. Is this little bit of time where we take the wine either out of barrel or we're racking it out of tank, and we've already got our blend, we got everything put together, we got everything in the right place, we got all the flavors we want, and this is a chance that you have to screw everything up. And where I see a lot of things go wrong are simple mistakes that allow oxygen to get into the wine and do a bunch of damage. So that time where you're going from final tank to filtering to bottle is really a time to pay a little extra special attention to detail. And the key here is dissolved oxygen. We've talked about this before, but I want to kind of hit it over your head again. Really important measure for wine production. Oxygen can be picked up all over the place. Saturated water can hold about 10 milligrams a liter of dissolved oxygen. Saturated wine can hold about 7 milligrams a liter of dissolved oxygen. Ethanol doesn't hold it as well. But if you do everything right, a well-handled wine will always have less than 1 milligram per liter of dissolved oxygen before bottling. So you've got to really pay attention to that. So why it's important is during bottling, a lot can be picked up. So I worked with a lady named Liz Waters out of the AWRI, where she did an experiment where we did some hand bottling on a hand bottling line, much like ours, and we measured dissolved oxygen at a whole host of different places, and we saw where things got picked up. So just leaving the tank open without having some sort of inert gas on top of it, just during the bottling process, just letting air get to it, will pick up about 0.5 milligram per liter of dissolved oxygen right there. And then at the top of the bottle filler, if you don't have the filler bowl blanketed right at that point in time, you pick up another 0.5 milligram a liter just in the bowl. So between those 2 points, you can pick up 1 milligram a liter of dissolved oxygen. I'll talk about why that's really important. Then if you don't sparge the bottle, just going into the bottle without some inert gas in the bottle, you'll pick up 1 milligram per liter. So then on top of that, for every milliliter of ullage in the bottle, or headspace in the bottle, you're going to pick up about 0.3 milligrams per liter. So this is one of those things where it's not like there's a one, single place where you can pick things up. There's multiple places. And another place where I see oxygen picked up a whole lot is simply not good seals on the clamps or a hole in a hose. That can draw oxygen into the wine at a pretty impressive tick, and you can do a lot of damage. But the thing is you've just got to be measuring at a lot of different points in time to make sure you're not picking up too much. So if you do a really bad job bottling, you can pick up about 3 milligrams a liter of dissolved oxygen, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. So why does DO matter? Well, it takes 4 milligrams per liter of SO2 to neutralize 1 milligram per liter of oxygen. But let's talk about that. SO2 and oxygen don't directly interact. Oxygen gets into the wine, goes in and oxidizes something, and then SO2 mops up the problem that comes later on. So oxygen goes in, probably oxidizes ethanol or something else, usually to acetaldehyde, and then the SO2 has to mop that up. But there's an oxidation process that's going on. So we see that can lead to quite a bit of problems in the bottle. So you got to think about this in a very reasonable way, that the primary reason that we have bottle shock is because of bad oxygen pickup during bottling. So we talk about bottle shock a lot. If you want to minimize bottle shock, you want your wines to go right to market quickly, that all has to do with dissolved oxygen. Not all, but a good chunk of it. So the thing is that if you are going to pick up a bunch of DO, you're going to have to add extra SO2 levels to the wine to help mop that up. But then you're adding a bunch of SO2, and that's knocking things around and taking things out of equilibrium. And then you're having an oxidation, and then SO2 is mopping it up. And you can see how that could lead to a real loss of flavor and aroma. And it takes wines a long time to recover from that. And that's where the idea of bottle shock comes from. I think well-bottled wine doesn't shock. If you don't do a good job, this is where it comes from. So the way you measure is simply measured with a dissolved oxygen meter. You can buy a whole bunch of them. There's some really neat new ones that run on sort of a UV vis. that are much better. They're the best one I've known of so far is called an Orbisphere, but they're really expensive. But there's some new ones hitting the market that are really good. I encourage you to research some different DO meters. I'm still trying to find the best one out there. We use the little Milwaukee one in the middle because it's about 150 bucks and pretty easy to use. So there's a whole bunch out there, but you simply have to use them, and then you just have to calibrate them. The best way to calibrate a DO meter is to put a nitrogen stone in a pitcher of water or a bucket of water and sparge the water for about 15 minutes, and that creates a perfect zero oxygen environment for you to zero out your DO probe. So the other thing we want to talk about is that final rack and tank holding. So we want to use inert gas in the barrel during that racking. That's where those bulldogs come into come into play. Another thing that you can do as a prophylactic measure is sparge the tank with nitrogen post racking to disperse any dissolved oxygen. So what some people might do is just rack the wine. Don't worry about it. You know you're going to pick up a little bit, but it's not going to react very quickly. Oxygen doesn't react fast with other things. So especially to make acetaldehyde, it's a fairly slow chemical reaction, takes a few days. So if you might just want to go ahead and rack and then just sparge the tank, get out your dissolved oxygen stone, and put nitrogen in, sparge the tank after racking, and you'll get rid of that dissolved oxygen. Measure it until you get your DO down to close to 0 or under a milligram per liter. Other things you want to do is gas your tanks regularly, if not daily, with CO2 or argon. Argon is good, but you have to deliver it through a big hose, at least 1 to 2 inches in diameter, and you have to flood the tank regularly. But realize that gassing of tanks doesn't really work unless you have a sealed tank, it was full, and you pushed it out with an inert gas. So like a keg and CO2, something like that, where you had a full tank and you pushed it out, because you can never fully get rid of all of the oxygen in that headspace. I use CO2. It does dissolve, but we can sparge that out too. So I use CO2 because it's portable, comes in snow, and you can throw it in the top of the tank. Again, monitor that dissolved oxygen during tank and settling process. So your final rack, critical control point. White is really more important than red. Red does have extra capacity to absorb oxygen. Those phenolics do a wonderful job for us. They save us a lot of heartache, and that's why reds are so much more forgiving than whites. But the other things we want to do on that racking is do a visual check, make sure everything is really clean, and then we blanket the tank before filling. A lot of times I even blow inert gas through the hoses. So I'll hook up the hose to the end of a nitrogen tank and blow the whole system out. And most importantly, and this is what I see happen all the time, is people are racking from tank to tank and they get out their phone and start talking, or somebody shows up and they forget something's going on. This happened to my dad. My dad made the most beautiful Merlot back in 1995. It was like one of the most epically gorgeous Merlots we'd ever had. And we bottled part of it, and then he wanted to rack to a smaller tank because we didn't get a bottle at all. We wanted to bottle it another day. And a guy showed up, and while he was racking, and left the pump running for about half an hour, and it was bubbling air through it. And the difference in the wine before the pump running dry and after was staggering. Just how much getting that dissolved oxygen into that wine really, really knocked it around. So the wines that we bottled before were really prized possessions because they were absolutely delicious. The ones after were not nearly as good. Filtering, you got to be really careful on this. This is a picture of our crossflow. And whenever you're filtering, no matter what type of filter you're using, you're going to want to blow that filter out completely with an inert gas. And generally, you want to fill up the whole unit with water first, so it's completely full, so there's no bubbles coming through, and then push everything out with nitrogen. And the reason you want to do that is you want to make sure every pore is completely, cleaned and there's no air in there. Because if you think of a filter, we talk about depth entrapment, all that stuff. This is a huge, space of air. It's a big sponge. And so when you pump wine through it, if you don't have all that oxygen out, you're going to add a tremendous amount of oxygen. And I've seen so many people just load up plate and frame filters and start pumping wine through them, and just absolutely terrible to the wine. So if you do a really, really good job of plate and frame filtration, you're still going to pick up 1 to 2 milligrams a liter. of dissolved oxygen if you do everything perfectly. But cross flows are really neat because if you blow them out and completely, you can actually keep your dissolved oxygen to pretty much none in that process, as long as you're blanketing the tank on both sides. So again, filtering really well. Again, that idea of washing the filter, purging the system with nitrogen. And then while you're filtering, it's kind of an arduous process, but you want to watch all of your equipment. You're going to want to check all of the gaskets. You're going to want to check the hoses. You're going to want to look for bubbles, anything like that, because you don't want to see any hoses or any holes in your plumbing system pulling oxygen, because that can be very detrimental. And then blanket the tank before, during, and after filling. In this picture, you can see there's a little orange hose hanging over. And a lot of times when I'm filtering, I'll just turn on the CO2 on really, really low and just let it sort of sit there and continually blanket the tank as we're filling. A lot of times I just throw snow on top too, but generally the idea here is to keep that tank completely blanketed with an inert gas on both sides, the output tank and the input tank, to make sure that you don't pull anything. And the other reason you really want to gas that the tank that you're pulling from the top is eventually you're going to get to a point where you're going to pull some sort of gas. And if you have CO2 gas or something heavy, argon, blanketing the tank, when you pull that last bit of wine out and you get some bubbles into the filter, all the bubbles are going to be an inert gas. They're not going to be oxygen. So that's the real important reason for keeping that the tank that you're pulling from blanketed. All right, then just before you bottle, you got to check every tank. You go through, you check your DOs, make sure they're all below 1 milligram a liter. I think we were about 0.5 across the board going into bottling, somewhere down as low as 0. And if they're not, just sparge the tank. As a general rule, before we go to bottle, the morning before we bottle, first thing I do is I walk in and I drop the sparging stone in every single tank. And I just go through for about 1 to 2 minutes per tank and sparge every tank, needed or not. And that does a couple of things. Number one, we're getting rid of dissolved oxygen. We're totally homogenizing the tank in case there were any SO2 ads or carboxymethylcellulose ads or sugar ads or anything else. That sparge, taking that stone all the way to the bottom and sparging the tank, mixes it. And you make sure you've got a really homogeneous wine all the way through. And I've seen that happen. And we've done that at College Cellars, where we bottled some Muscat one year. And I did the juice ad right at the end. And I didn't really sparge the tank. And so the juice sat on the bottom of the tank, and we ended up bottling 9 cases of straight juice. And there was a transition point when we were bottling, when it went from a wine where it was 9% alcohol and perfect, and it transitioned right into juice within a case. It was absolutely amazing. And so now I just go through and make sure that we sparge every tank beforehand. So that way you homogenize it and you get rid of any dissolved oxygen. All right, bottling critical control points everywhere. You sparge everything. So again, that idea of sparging before we go every single time, always. The only time we don't do that is with Muscat. And the reason we don't do that with Muscat is because we're using CO2. So those tanks are usually under pressure with CO2, like a bright tank, where we're pushing CO2 through, and we're going to push that wine into the bottling line with carbon dioxide. So we use a lot of CO2. The Muscat's a little bit of an oddity. So those types of bottling lines are a little bit different. We kind of make it work, but generally, you're not, unless you're bottling sparkling wine for real, use a sparkling wine bottling line like the one at Blue Mountain Cider Company. The ham-fisted thing we do with Muscat is hilarious, but probably not the best way to do things. And then again, that idea of mixing the tank and then dissolved oxygen check before, during, and afterwards. And so before you're bottling, you start running, and then if you're bottling and you pull a bottle off and you go run a DO, and all of a sudden your DO's up, you stop the line and find out where it's coming in because you're getting an ingress from somewhere. And so in DO's really quick and easy to measure. So we do it about every 25-ish cases. Big wineries I know do it about every pallet. So about every 50 cases they pull a bottle, and sometimes they even just have a sample bottle that they rotate through that has kind of a dissolved oxygen probe built into it. So they just throw that bottle on the line, it goes through, and they pull it out, and then they can check the DO right on the spot. And that way they're not having to destroy bottles and labels and other things. Last thing I want to talk about is the ullage or vacuity between the closure and the wine. So if you have a cork bottle, and the problem is we've made bottles where they have as much space for a cork, especially the screw caps, there's this big uh, kind of area there. And that screw cap ullage, if you talk about that, 10 or that 20 or 30, mil headspace, you've got almost 1 milligram a liter of O2 right there. Depending on how full you fill the bottle, that's going to change your DO amount. But what's really interesting is bottles aren't all the same size. So you're supposed to fill to 750 milliliters, and sometimes you put 750 mils of wine in, and it's down at like the mid shoulder, and it looks terrible. So you have two options on your hands. Either you overfill, the bottle and put more wine in than you need, and then you lose product, and that costs you money. Or B, you fill to the right level and have to, evacuate the container. And what's really interesting to note is that really, really check your volumes, especially on new screw cap bottles, because some of the new screw cap bottles now have got it where 750 mils is only a little tiny ways down in the neck of the bottle to make up for that difference. And I do know a local winery that got in big trouble because they didn't know that. They were just bottling, they weren't checking their volumes. And somebody, one of their customers, checked the wine, and sure enough, he only had about 735, 740 mils in each bottle. And so the customer called up the TTB and let him know that this winery was underfilling their wine. And the guy didn't know. He was, just filling it to the level he thought it was supposed to be, but wasn't measuring volume. So really important to measure volume, and really important to get that ullage space just right. And so, but one of the things you can do is you can fix it. So if you have a big space, you go ahead and do your nitrogen dropping. And this is our Riesling getting bottled with little nitrogen drops in it. Plink, plink, plink. And you can see them kind of steaming as they go by. And that gets rid of any oxygen in that headspace. So if you're really trying to be ultra diligent and not using a whole lot of extra SO2 and things like that. And for something like a Riesling where you've got to be really on the razor's edge, because you might go to bottle with 15, 18 parts free SO2 at a pH of 3.0, and if you have 2 or 3 milligrams a liter of DO, boom, you just lost all your free SO2, and the wine's on a track to nowhere good real fast. So nitrogen dropping is just that really extra step to make sure that you've got a nice oxygen, as close to oxygen free bottling as possible. And if you want to minimize that idea of bottle shock, this is a really good thing to do. So, conclusion, during bottling, oxygen management is absolutely key. Get a good dissolved oxygen meter for everything. It goes a long way. It's kind of fun to measure a barrel from time to time and see how much you got in there. At each point in the final racking, filtering, and bottling, there's a lot of critical control points to keep dissolved oxygen at a minimum. So just again, check everything. Make sure that you're not picking up oxygen, because this is the core tenet of what causes bottle shock, and wine's just not to taste very good after they've been filtered and bottled. So that concludes our oxygen management series, and cheers.